At the age of 70, Tom Hanks stands as a living monument of American cinema, a man whose career journey has far exceeded the ordinary concept of success, with more than 4 decades of dedication and dozens of unforgettable films. He is one of the very few actors in history to win 2 consecutive Best Actor Oscars with Philadelphia and Forrest Gump, roles that not only brought him glory, but also changed the way Hollywood viewed him. Works like Saving Private Ryan, Castaway, or The Green Mile have turned his name into a global icon, while his voice in the Toy Story series has been tied to the childhood of millions of audiences. The total box office revenue of the films he has participated in reaches tens of billions of dollars, making him one of the biggest box office draws of all time. Not stopping at acting, he is also a producer behind heritage projects like Band of Brothers, contributing to reenacting history in a deeply humanistic way. In 2016, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors, as recognition for his influence beyond the screen, where he is not only an artist, but also a symbol of kindness and faith in American culture. But behind all that glory is a man who has carried too much for too long, a man carrying cracks that the spotlight never reaches, when diabetes silently erodes his body, when health fluctuations after COVID remind him that even icons have limits, and when the pressure to always be perfect makes him unable to allow himself to be weak. There are nights he wakes up in silence, not because of work, but because of nameless thoughts about family, about past mistakes, about the fear that one day he will no longer be the person the public trusts. And it is precisely in that inner struggle that what keeps him going is not fame or awards, but a very simple yet persistent will. The will to keep showing up, to keep working, to keep being the best version of himself possible, even when inside he is tired. Because after all, Tom Hanks is not someone who has never fallen, but someone who has never allowed himself to stop. Before we step further into the story behind that halo, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a small way to honor the man who has devoted his entire life to not collapsing before the world. If the life of Tom Hanks at the age of 70 makes people wonder why a seemingly perfect man carries so much fatigue, then the answer does not begin under the spotlight, but begins from a childhood where everything shattered too early, where a child learned to grow up without any sense of belonging to anyone. His parents divorced when he was very young, not in noisy separations, but in a cold detachment, where relationships gradually fell apart like puzzle pieces that no longer fit, and that child, instead of being held and reassured, was swept along by the flow of decisions he did not understand, pulled from one place to another, from one person to another, as if life itself had never known where to place him correctly. There were years when the concept of family for him was not a place, but a fragmented memory, changing faces, houses that never had time to become familiar before he had to leave, and each time like that, he lost a little more of the ability to believe that he truly belonged somewhere. Because when you leave too many times, you start not daring to attach anymore, not daring to call any place home, because deep inside you know it could disappear at any moment. Evenings for a child like him were not times of warmth, but prolonged silences, where no one really asked how his day had been, no one listened to thoughts that had not yet formed into words, and gradually he stopped trying to speak, because when a child speaks and no one responds, he learns to stay silent to avoid disappointment. That silence was not peace, but a protective shell, a way to survive in a world where he felt he was always on the edge, always the observer rather than the one being noticed. And it was from there that a strange habit formed. He began to look at others more than at himself, began to learn to read emotions, gestures, tones of voice, not because he wanted to, but because that was the only way to understand the world when no one explained it to him. Perhaps that is also why later, when he stepped into acting, he could become anyone, because from very early on, he had become accustomed to not being himself, had become accustomed to adjusting himself to fit the situation, to the person in front of him, to what was expected of him. But behind that ability is a more painful truth, that before becoming someone who could make the whole world believe in the characters he played, he had once been a child who did not know what to believe in, did not know who would stay, did not know where was permanent, and that feeling of being left behind, though not loud, not dramatic, quietly followed him throughout his life, seeping into the way he loved, the way he worked, the way he always tried to become someone no one could leave, because deep down, the child from back then is still there, still afraid that if he is not good enough, if he is not trustworthy enough, then one day everything will disappear again, just as it once did so long ago. And then, in a world where Tom Hanks had never truly felt he belonged, he accidentally stepped into another space. Not a house, not a family, but a stage, where the lights did not ask where he came from, did not care how his past had shattered, but only needed him to stand there and become someone else. And it was precisely in that seemingly artificial place that he first felt something he had never had in real life, which was the feeling of existing. The theater did not hug him the way a mother does, did not protect him the way a father does, but it gave him something even more important to a child who had become used to being forgotten, which was recognition, even if only for a few short hours, that he was there, that he mattered, that his presence was not superfluous. When standing on stage, he was no longer the quiet child sitting in the corner of the room, no longer the person who always felt he was outside other people's lives, but became the center of a story. Someone who was seen, who was listened to, who was trusted, and the strange thing is that the more he immersed himself in other people's lives, the more he forgot his own loneliness, as if each character was a mask that helped him breathe easier in a world where he himself had once felt suffocated. Acting, for him, did not begin as a brilliant dream, but as an escape, a shelter, a way to live lives he did not have the chance to experience in reality, and in that process he gradually developed a special ability, the ability to observe people almost instinctively, because from very early on he had learned to read what no one said, had become used to looking into eyes, gestures, the silences between words to understand what was really happening. On stage, those skills became strength, helping him not only to play a role, but to live in it, not only to act, but to feel. And the audience, though they did not know the story behind it, could still sense something very real in the way he performed, a sincerity that not everyone could fake. But even when the lights shone and the applause rang out, a part of him was never completely at ease. Because when you grow up in a world where everything can disappear at any moment, you will always carry the fear that what you have will not last forever. And therefore, each role for him was not only an opportunity, but also a challenge, a question repeating in his mind whether he deserved this position or not, whether he could be replaced at any time or not. When he began his professional career, the small roles, the failed auditions, the cold rejections made that fear even clearer. He did not enter Hollywood as someone confident in his talent, but as someone who always felt he was standing on unstable ground, where just one small mistake could make everything collapse. There were days he wondered if he was pursuing a path not meant for him. There were moments he looked at others and felt they were more confident, more certain, belonged here more than he did. And in those moments, the child from back then would appear again, still silent, still observing, still afraid of being left behind once more. But that very insecurity became the driving force, forcing him to try harder, to work more, to prepare better, to pour all his emotions into every role as if it were his last chance. Because for Tom Hanks, acting was not just a job, but the only place he had ever truly felt he existed. And perhaps that is also why he never dared to take it lightly, never dared to believe he was enough. Because deep inside, he still carried the fear that if one day the lights went out, if one day there were no more roles for him, then he would return to that old feeling, the feeling of someone standing on the sidelines, quietly watching the world pass by without knowing where he belonged. But even when Tom Hanks began to find his footing in the world of acting, the recognition he craved did not come in the way he expected, because Hollywood saw in him something pleasant, approachable, a gentle energy suited for comedic roles, characters that brought laughter, and so he gradually got placed into a mold he did not choose himself, where his talent was limited to making audiences smile instead of making them think or feel more deeply. Films like Big brought success, brought attention, even brought prestigious nominations, but at the same time unintentionally closed other doors. Because the more successful he became in one image, the more he got trapped in that very image. And for a person who had spent his entire childhood searching for recognition, being seen incorrectly for who he truly was became another form of loneliness. A form of loneliness that no one noticed, because from the outside everything seemed just fine. He appeared on screen with a smile, with naturalness, with a charm that made audiences love him. But behind that was a question that never disappeared: whether he was truly a good actor, or just someone lucky enough to be cast in pleasant roles. And that very question made him never feel he was enough, never dare to believe he had reached where he wanted. Meanwhile, his personal life entered a new chapter that was no less complicated when he married Samantha Louise, at a time when he himself did not yet fully understand who he was, did not yet fully understand what he needed. And perhaps deep inside, that decision did not entirely come from emotional readiness, but from a familiar fear, the fear of continuing to live alone, the fear of having no one by his side, the fear of being left behind once again. Marriage, instead of becoming a place of healing, quickly became a big responsibility, a pressure he had to carry while he was still struggling to build his career. And when the children were born, joy came along with a new burden, the burden of having to become a father when he had never had a clear model for that, the burden of having to bring in enough money when his career was still unstable, the burden of keeping the family from falling apart while he himself was struggling to keep himself from collapsing. There were days he had to accept any role available just to make ends meet. There were nights he lay thinking about the future with no clear answers. And in all of that, the doubt was still there, not leaving, seeping into every decision, every step, making him always feel he was only a very small distance away from failure. On the outside, he was still the man who brought laughter, still the familiar face that made audiences feel comfortable, but inside he knew he was standing on a fragile line, where one mistake could make everything collapse, where the stability he was trying to build could disappear as quickly as his childhood had once disappeared. And it was precisely in this period when success began to arrive but did not bring peace, when family began to form but did not bring a sense of solidity, when his career moved forward but he himself did not feel corresponding progress. Tom Hanks began to understand that sometimes the hardest thing was not complete failure, but living in a halfway state, where you had enough to continue but not enough to believe you had truly arrived, where you had to keep moving forward even though inside you were still full of unanswered questions, and where every smile on screen hid another bit of fatigue that no one could see. And then when Tom Hanks's career truly began to take off, when his name gradually appeared more often, when the roles were no longer just opportunities but became clear advancements, that was also the exact time when something else happened, quietly, something no spotlight ever reached, a slow but unstoppable crack in the very family he had tried so hard to build. The days he spent more time on set, the long trips, the packed work schedules, all the things that seemed necessary to hold on to the fragile opportunity he had worked so hard to get, gradually became distance between him and those at home. Because while he tried to become a good enough actor not to be replaced, somewhere else he was gradually becoming a husband and a father who was no longer present enough. The small moments, the missed dinners, the conversations that never happened, the times he returned when things had changed a little, and he did not notice in time, all accumulated into an increasingly large void. And the most painful thing was that the void did not come from one big event, did not come from a fierce argument, but from repeated absence, from not being there long enough to truly stay in the lives of the people he loved. His marriage to Samantha Louise did not collapse in a single moment, but wore away over time, like something that had once been very real but gradually became distant. And when it ended, there was no clear release, no feeling of relief, but only a heavy silence left, a prolonged sense of guilt that he carried for many years afterward. Because deep inside, he understood that no matter how many reasons, no matter how much pressure, the truth did not change, that he had not been there enough when his family needed him. What made that pain even deeper was that he continued to succeed, continued to move forward, continued to be recognized, and that very contrast made it harder for him to accept, because every step forward in his career reminded him of something he had lost. Every new achievement came with an old question of whether all this was worth it, if the price was the most important relationships in life. There were times he looked back and realized that success, which he once believed would bring stability, security, even happiness, did not have the ability to heal personal voids, could not turn back time, could not replace the moments he had missed, and could not erase the feeling that he had not fulfilled his role when he should have. In the role of a father, that regret became even clearer, because being a father was not a role that could be rehearsed. There was no chance to go back and do a scene better, and when the children grew up with memories in which he was not fully present, he was forced to face a hard truth, that there are things in life that cannot be fixed just by effort or willpower. From the outside, everything seemed to be going in the right direction. He was still a rising actor, still a man building his name. But inside, a part of him began to understand that this path, no matter where it took him, had left cracks that could not be erased, and that there were losses that did not come from failure, but from succeeding in a way that made you leave behind things you never wanted to leave. And it was precisely in this period, when light and darkness existed side by side, when every step forward came with a price, Tom Hanks began to carry a feeling that he would never completely escape, the feeling that no matter how far he went, no matter how much he achieved, there would still be a part of his life that remained forever behind, in a place where he could not stay when he should have been there. And then, at the exact time when the cracks in Tom Hanks's personal life had not yet had time to heal, an opportunity appeared. Not an easy one, but a turning point that required him to bet everything he had when he took the role in Philadelphia, a film that at that time was not just a movie project, but a risky territory, where the story about HIV/AIDS was still covered by prejudice and fear, and for an actor who was being framed in a comedic image like him to dare step into this role was not just a career decision, but a challenge to everything Hollywood had once thought about him. He lost weight, changed his appearance, dug deep into the character's pain, not to prove to others, but to answer himself that he could do more than what they had believed. And when the film was released, when audiences no longer laughed but fell silent when they saw a vulnerable human being, a person fighting injustice, that was also when his old image began to break, and a new image was formed, no longer just the one who brought laughter, but an actor capable of touching the deepest regions of emotion. The Oscar came as recognition he had waited for so long, but even in that moment, when standing on stage, he did not only carry pride, but also carried all the years of doubt, all the times he felt he was not enough. And perhaps that is why that victory was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a new burden. Because right after that, with Forrest Gump, he not only repeated success, but surpassed it, taking his name to a height very few could reach, becoming an icon not only of cinema, but of popular culture as well. A person everyone knew, everyone trusted. A person who seemed incapable of doing wrong. But that very moment, when the whole world began to see him as a standard, was also when he began to lose something important, the right to not be perfect. From someone who had to prove he was good enough, he became someone who had to maintain the best image. And those two states, though they might look similar on the surface, were completely different, because if proving allowed you to make mistakes and fix them, maintaining did not allow you to make mistakes from the start. The awards, the praises, the articles calling him the nicest man in Hollywood, all gradually formed a shell he could not easily step out of, because the more he was loved, the more careful he had to be. The more he had to preserve, the more he had to ensure no crack showed to the public. And while the world looked at him as a perfect success story, as someone who had overcome all difficulties to reach the peak, inside, he began to feel a different kind of pressure. The pressure of not being allowed to slip, not being allowed to be tired, not being allowed to have days when he was not the best version of himself. There were moments he wondered whether what he had achieved was freedom or not, or just another form of constraint, where he had to continue living according to the image others had created for him, where every decision had to be weighed not only based on what he wanted, but on what everyone expected from him. And it was precisely in that change, from someone who was rising to someone who had already reached the top, that Tom Hanks began to understand that success did not always bring relief, that sometimes it simply replaced old worries with new ones, worries that were deeper, harder to express, and harder to escape. Because when you have become an icon, being yourself again becomes a luxury you cannot always allow yourself to have. But even when Tom Hanks stepped past the peak of recognition, when his name no longer needed to prove anything but simply appearing was enough to be trusted, something else gradually formed, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently and tightening over time. That was the trap of becoming the nicest man in Hollywood, a title that at first glance looked like a reward, but in reality was a constraint he could not easily remove. Because when the whole world agreed that you were the symbol of kindness, of trust, of the values they wanted to preserve, then you were no longer simply a human being. You became a model, a standard, something others relied on to believe that this world still had good things, and from that moment, every action of yours no longer belonged only to you. Every word no longer reflected only personal thoughts, but became part of the image that millions of people were placing their faith in. He began to realize that everything he did, no matter how small, was being observed, analyzed, evaluated, from the way he answered interviews, the way he appeared in public, to the choices in his career. All carried a weight that not everyone understood, because just one inappropriate moment, one untimely sentence, one uncontrolled expression could crack the image he had spent decades building. And precisely because of that, he began to control himself to a degree that sometimes even he did not realize. He thought before speaking, weighed before acting, kept his emotions within safe limits, not because he no longer had emotions, but because he no longer had the freedom to express them in the most natural way. There were times he felt angry. There were times he was tired. There were times he wanted to let go of everything and simply live like a normal person. But as soon as those emotions appeared, another part of him immediately pulled back, reminding him that he could not, that he was not allowed, that he had to continue being the person the world trusted, even if that meant having to hide the most real parts of himself. Over time, that caution was no longer a choice, but became a habit, a default state, causing him to gradually lose the boundary between his true self and his public image, causing him to no longer be sure which reactions were natural and which were adjusted to fit expectations. And this, though no one saw it, created a very particular form of fatigue, a prolonged tension that did not come from work, but from having to maintain a perfect version of himself for such a long time. The years passed. When the title America's Dad became increasingly attached to his name, it was not just praise, but became a constant reminder that he could no longer make mistakes like others, that he had to always stand firm, always be right, always be a support. And while that brought respect, brought affection, it also took away something he perhaps never realized he was gradually losing, which was the right to be a human with imperfect moments. And it was precisely in the silence of those years, when no major incidents occurred, when everything seemed still stable, that Tom Hanks again faced a challenge that was not easy to notice, but no less heavy, the challenge of living in an image he could not leave, the challenge of upholding the trust of the entire world without revealing the cracks inside. And perhaps the hardest thing was not that others expected too much, but that he gradually expected even more from himself than anyone else, to the point of no longer allowing himself to stop, to be weak, or simply to be himself in a world where he had unintentionally become a symbol. And then, in the years when Tom Hanks gradually got used to living in an image that was not allowed to be wrong, amid the quiet pressures he could not share, something else appeared, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to change the way he looked at life. That was when he met Rita Wilson, a person who did not see him as a symbol, did not see him as the nicest man in Hollywood, but saw him as a human with all his imperfect parts. And perhaps that very thing, the ordinariness in the way she looked at him, became the most special thing he had ever had, different from previous relationships where he entered with the fear of being left behind, with uncertainty about himself, with a part of him always ready to defend. This time he began to feel a form of stability he had never had, a feeling that there was a place that did not disappear, a person who did not leave, and that's for someone who had grown up in constant change, in unstable connections, held a deeper meaning than anything else. Their marriage was not a perfect story without difficulties, but a journey where both learned to understand each other, learned to stay, learned to build something not based on fear but on choice, and in that process he gradually found a balance, not absolute peace, but a state where he could breathe easier, could be himself a little more than before. The family he built with Rita was not like the fragmented memories of his childhood. It had presence. It had listening. It had small moments that were enough to create a sense of belonging, and it was precisely in those seemingly simple things that he began to understand that there were things that could not be found in fame or success, but only existed in real relationships. But even so, the old wounds did not disappear just because he had found something better. They were still there, quietly affecting the way he loved, the way he reacted, the way he perceived everything. Because when you have lost too much, you will always carry a part of the fear that it could happen again, and therefore, even when happy, a part of you still does not completely let go, still keeps a small distance to protect yourself. There were times he realized that he loved but was still cautious, that he trusted but was still careful, that he wanted to stay, but still feared that one day everything would change. And those feelings were not because the present had problems, but because the past had not completely left. This made his love not completely natural, but a conscious choice, an effort not to let fear dominate, an attempt not to repeat what had happened before. And that very thing, though no one saw it, was an important part in the way he maintained his family. At the same time, the fame and image he had built continued to exist, continued to place expectations on him, and this created a fragile balance between his personal life and his public image, between the real person and the symbol everyone saw, forcing him to constantly adjust, to keep everything from deviating from the orbit, to ensure that what he had would not be lost. And perhaps that was exactly why, even when he had found a place to belong, a family to return to, Tom Hanks still did not completely escape the feeling of anxiety, a quiet but always present feeling that the best things in his life were also the most fragile, that the stability he had was not something taken for granted, but something that needed to be preserved every day, and that sometimes loving was not just emotion, but a journey of overcoming the very fears he had carried for so long. And then, when Tom Hanks began to believe that he had found a form of balance in life, that this family could be a place where he did not have to fear being lost. Another reality gradually emerged, a reality he could not control with effort or willpower, that being a father did not always mean being able to protect his children from everything and his relationship with his children, like many other parts of his life, was not simple, not even, but carried many intertwined states between pride, worry, and even difficult-to-express silences. With Colin Hanks, he saw a more pleasant reflection, an adult child, stable, gradually building his own path in the industry he himself had been attached to. And in that development, there was a quiet pride, not loud, not needing to be shown, but enough for him to feel that there were things he had done right, that there were values that had been passed on completely. But life did not stop at such a story, because with Chet Hanks everything became more complicated, more unpredictable, when personal incidents, controversial choices, periods of drifting appeared, and in those moments, the image of a father was no longer someone who could direct everything, but became someone who stood watching, worried, trying to help, but unable to control the outcome. There were times he had to witness his child facing mistakes he could not prevent, decisions he could not change, and that created a very particular feeling of helplessness, the feeling that no award, no success could soothe, because being a father was not a role that could be adjusted according to a script. There was no way to guarantee everything would go the right way just because you had tried hard enough. In times like that, the contrast between the public image and family reality became clearer than ever, when on the outside he was still the man the whole world trusted, the one everyone thought could solve every problem with calmness and wisdom. But inside, he was a father learning to accept that there were things beyond his ability. That love was not always enough to fix. That presence was not always able to prevent the paths his children chose. This did not make him give up, did not make him stop trying, but it forced him to change the way he looked. From trying to control, to learning to be there, from wanting to fix, to accepting. And that process, though necessary, was not easy at all, because it required him to face his own fears, the fear that he had not done enough, that the periods of absence in the past had left influences he could not reverse. There were moments he wondered if things could have been different, if he had been there more, if he had chosen family over work at certain times, if he had not let distance form too early. And those questions, though without clear answers, still remained, still repeated in the quietest moments. And it was precisely in those contradictions, between pride and worry, between what he could do and what he could not change, that Tom Hanks gradually understood that the role of a father was not a journey of perfection, but a journey of presence, of being there even without solutions, of loving even knowing he could not protect his children from everything. And perhaps the hardest thing was not accepting his children's mistakes, but accepting his own limits in changing those things. And then, when the invisible pressures from family and fame had not yet had time to settle down, another reality began to emerge more clearly for Tom Hanks, a reality he could not overcome with willpower or discipline the way he once did with his career. That was the change in his own body, a change that was slow but irreversible, forcing him to face limits he previously thought he could control. When he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, it was not just a simple piece of medical information, but a clear reminder that the years he had pushed his body for roles, the extreme weight gains and losses to serve the art, the cycles of change he once considered necessary, had now left consequences he would have to carry for the long term. And this did not come suddenly, but accumulated through each year, each project, each time he placed the demands of the role above his own health. There were periods when he was forced to completely change his appearance, to accept harsh diets, stressful work schedules. And at that time, he did not think about the consequences, because the most important thing was to complete the role, to not disappoint anyone, to hold on to the position he had worked so hard to achieve. But the body, unlike fame, could not maintain itself forever under pressure without reacting, And over time, the signs began to appear, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for him to realize that he was no longer in the stage where everything could recover quickly. The days he felt low on energy became more frequent. The prolonged fatigue was no longer rare, and there were mornings when starting a new day was no longer as easy as before, when the body seemed to slow down, to feel heavier, no longer responding in the way he had been used to for many years. What made this change so hard to accept was not only in the specific symptoms, but in the way it forced him to adjust his view of himself, because for a long time he had become accustomed to being able to work non-stop, to adapting to any demands of a role, to maintaining a pace that not everyone could keep up with. And now he had to learn to slow down, to learn to listen to his body, to learn to accept that there were limits he could not overcome with willpower alone. There were moments he felt confused in the face of that very change, when things that had once been very natural now became more difficult, when what he once considered normal now required more effort to maintain. And in those moments, he was not only facing a health issue, but also a deeper question about himself, about who he was when he no longer had the ability to do everything as before, about whether his value changed or not when his body could no longer keep up with what he wanted. At the same time, the fatigue came not only from the physical, but also blended with the pressures that had accumulated from before, from work, from family, from the image he had to maintain, making each day not only a health challenge, but also a journey to keep the balance between what he could do and what he needed to accept. And it was precisely in this process that Tom Hanks began to understand that the body was not an infinite tool, that everything he had achieved had its price, and that there were times when the hardest thing was not to keep moving forward, but to stop at the right moment, to accept that he could no longer endure as before, and to learn to live with a version of himself that was no longer perfect, but still continued to exist and continued to try in its own way. And then, when Tom Hanks was still learning to accept the new limits of his body, when he began to adjust his life rhythm to adapt to the changes he could not reverse, another event occurred, not only to him, but to the whole world. An event no one could prepare for in advance, and, for the first time in his long journey, he had to face a situation for which he had no experience, no role that could help him understand beforehand. That was when he contracted COVID-19 in the early days of the pandemic, at a time when everything was still unclear, when information was still vague, when fear spread faster than the disease itself. He was in Australia working on a normal project like any other, until the first signs appeared: fatigue, aches, the feeling that his body was no longer functioning normally. And then the test results confirmed what no one wanted to hear, that he had contracted the disease. And in just one moment, everything changed, not only for him, but for the way the whole world looked at the situation. Because when a person like him, a symbol of stability, of trust, of the things the public relied on to feel safe, also became one of the first to publicly contract the disease, then the story was no longer just about personal health, but became a sign that no one was truly outside of what was happening. The media quickly spread the information. His name appeared everywhere, not in the context of a new film or an award, but in news reports about the pandemic, and that created a very different feeling, a feeling he himself could not control, when his private life suddenly became part of the global story. During the days of isolation, when he and Rita Wilson had to face the disease in separation, with no lights, no audience, no roles to hold on to, he went through a state he had perhaps never experienced before. A state of clear fragility, where nothing was certain anymore, where the body was no longer something he could rely on, and where the things he once believed were stable became easily breakable. There were times he felt weaker, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet way, an exhaustion that forced him to stop, to listen to his body in a way he had rarely done before, and in those moments, he was no longer the icon, No longer the man the whole of America trusted, but just a human being trying to get through a disease that no one knew where it would lead. What made this experience different was not only the disease itself, but the way it stripped away the sense of control he had been familiar with for many years. Because in his career, in life, he could always prepare, could always adjust, could always make decisions, but this time he could not do much more than wait. Wait for his body to respond, wait for time to pass, wait to see what would happen next. And it was precisely in that waiting that he faced a truth he did not always want to admit, that there were things in life that lay beyond human control, that no matter how successful you were, no matter how well prepared you were, there would still be moments when you could only stand still and accept. When he shared his condition with the public, there was no panic, no grand statements, but only the familiar calmness, a way of communicating he had built over many years. But behind that was a very real experience, an experience that forced him to look back at everything from a different angle, an angle where safety was no longer taken for granted, where health could no longer be postponed, and where life was no longer measured by achievements but by what remained when everything else paused, and when he gradually recovered. When his body began to regain stability, that experience did not disappear but stayed like a mark, a reminder that the things he once considered certain could change quickly, that the things he once controlled could slip out of reach, and that sometimes the most important thing was not what you could do, but what you accepted when you could do nothing at all. And in that journey, Tom Hanks did not only overcome a disease, but also stepped through a new threshold of awareness, where he understood more clearly the fragility of himself, the limits of human beings before major events, and that strength was not always in the ability to control, but sometimes in accepting that there were things you could not change. But you still continued to go through them in the calmest way you could, and after everything that had happened, after the times his body forced him to stop, after the experience when the whole world looked at a moment when he no longer had control, Tom Hanks returned to a more familiar but heavier reality than ever. That was the burden he had carried for many decades, the burden of having to maintain an image whose full depth not everyone could understand. Because while major events could come and go, the pressure of becoming a symbol never left. It was not loud. It did not appear like a shock, but existed quietly, repeating every day, in every small decision, in every public appearance, in every word he had to consider carefully. For many years, he had become used to not allowing himself to appear weak in front of others, not because he did not have such moments, but because he understood that his image did not belong only to him personally, but was also tied to the trust of so many people, and that made him keep many things to himself. Had to handle emotions on his own without being able to share them freely, had to find ways to balance without much space to let go. There were nights he lay awake, not because of any specific work, but because of repeating thoughts about past decisions, about things that could have been different if he had chosen another path, about parts of life he still had not fully understood. And in those moments, when there were no lights, no roles, no audience, he had to face himself in a way no one else could see. The anxiety did not come in the form of panic, but in the form of small but persistent questions, doubts not big enough to break everything, but enough to keep him from ever feeling completely at ease. Enough to remind him that everything he had could change, that the image he had built was not permanent, and that just one small deviation could create reactions he could not control. And so he continued to maintain stability, continued to appear with calmness, continued to do what people expected, even when inside there were times he felt tired, felt like stopping, felt like simplifying everything so he would not have to think too much. But stopping was not easy when you had become used to having to continue, when you had tied your value to the ability to maintain, to not disappointing anyone, and that led to a question that became clearer and clearer in his mind, a question he perhaps did not always want to answer, that if one day he could no longer maintain that perfection, If one day he was no longer the person everyone expected, then where would his value lie? Would he still be seen in the way he had become used to, or would everything change in a way he could not predict? That question had no clear answer, and perhaps that was exactly why it stayed, becoming part of the thoughts he carried, not as a single burden, but as a background layer that always existed behind everything he did. And in the process of continuing to live, continuing to work, continuing to appear, Tom Hanks gradually understood that there were pressures that could not be completely removed, only learned to live with them, that there were questions that did not need immediate answers, and that sometimes the hardest thing was not overcoming a major event, but carrying things that were not completely clear for a very long time while still continuing to move forward. And when those questions could no longer be pushed away by work or the habit of maintaining an image, Tom Hanks gradually entered a stage where he was forced to face the things he had kept to himself for many years, the emotions that were never fully spoken, the anxieties and self-doubts that did not fit the image the public was familiar with, and therefore were always kept behind the calm smile he had learned to maintain. Not loud crises, but repeating thoughts in silence. Moments when he wondered whether everything he had built was solid enough to survive if one day he could no longer keep the familiar balance, whether his family's affection was strong enough not to be affected by the mistakes he always tried to avoid, and whether the position he held in the public's heart truly belonged to his real self, or was only the result of an image he had worked so hard to maintain for many years. The fear of loss did not come from a specific event, but from realizing that the things he cherished most, family, the trust of audiences, the stability he had taken so long to achieve, were not things that could be guaranteed forever, and that very awareness made him never completely let go, always keeping a part of himself ready to face the possibility of loss, even when everything on the outside still seemed stable. In quieter periods, when he was no longer swept up in the pace of work, he began to look back at past decisions, not to judge, but to understand, to see more clearly what had led him to the present, and in that process regrets appeared. Not grand things, but small details, moments when he had not been present, choices he had made in circumstances he believed were right at the time, but when looking back, carried a different meaning. He realized that success, no matter how great, did not have the ability to erase the wounds that had existed before, that the cracks from the past did not disappear just because the present was better, and that there were parts of him that had been formed from experiences he could not change, only understand and accept. This did not make him pessimistic, but made him look at life with a different caution, a clearer awareness that nothing was absolute, that every choice carried its consequences, and that sometimes the important thing was not avoiding mistakes completely, but how you lived with what had happened. And it was precisely in that process that he gradually faced something he had rarely allowed himself to do before, which was to look straight at his true self, not through the lens of the public, not through roles, not through titles, but as an individual with strengths and weaknesses, with successes and shortcomings, with parts that had been refined and parts that were still unclear. This confrontation did not bring immediate relief, because it demanded honesty that was not always easy to accept. But it created a space where he did not need to maintain an image, where he could exist without having to fit others' expectations. And in that space, even if it only appeared in short moments, Tom Hanks began to feel a different kind of peace, not perfection, but acceptance, not the absence of problems, but not having to hide everything anymore. And perhaps that very thing, even if it came late, was an important part of his journey, a journey not only outward toward what he had achieved, but also inward toward what he was gradually understanding more clearly about himself. And after everything he had been through, after the years carrying questions without clear answers, Tom Hanks began to enter another stage of his life. Not a sudden turning point, but a slow shift in the way he perceived everything, where the rhythm of life was no longer completely dominated by work, where choices no longer revolved around having to prove or maintain an image, but gradually focused on things that might have been set aside before. He did not abandon his career, did not turn his back on what had made his name, but he began to choose more selectively, to work in ways that suited his health, his mental state, and the new priorities he realized were more important, which were family, the relationships he did not want to keep missing, the moments he no longer wanted to let pass without being present. In that change, he spent more time on simple things, unhurried meals, conversations not interrupted by schedules, days when he did not need to appear in public. And it was precisely in those seemingly small things that he began to find a form of peace he had not truly experienced before. Not absolute quiet, but the feeling of not having to strain to become some version of himself, not having to constantly prove his value through new achievements. Reevaluating what was important in life did not happen in a single moment, but was a process where he gradually realized that the things once placed first might no longer hold that position. That fame, though still meaningful, was no longer the center. That recognition, though still valuable, was no longer the only measure. And that what he truly wanted to keep was not the perfect image, but the real connections, the things that could exist even when the spotlight turned off. In that process, he also began to let go of some of the pressure he had carried for too long, not by completely rejecting expectations, but by not letting them dominate every decision, not letting them become the only standard to judge himself. And this was not easy, because after many years of living in caution, allowing himself to be more relaxed, more flexible, required an adjustment that was not always natural. There were times he still returned to old habits, still wondered if he was doing the right thing, if he was still keeping what others expected. But gradually those questions no longer occupied his entire mind as before. They became a smaller part in a larger picture, where he had more space to look at other things. The search for peace was not a journey of completely eliminating anxieties, but learning to live with them without letting them dominate, finding value in things that did not need to be shown, accepting that there were imperfect days, moments that did not need to be recorded, and that this did not diminish the meaning of life. And perhaps the most important thing in this stage was acceptance, not surrender, but the clear understanding that there were things that could not be changed, past decisions that could not be returned to, losses that could not be completely replaced. And instead of trying to fix everything, he chose to live with them, to understand them, and to let them become part of who he was, without needing to hide them anymore. In that acceptance, Tom Hanks did not become a different person, but became closer to himself, no longer completely defined by what he had achieved, but by the way he continued to live, continued to be present, and continued to hold on to the things he believed were meaningful, even as everything else gradually changed. And after all, when looking back at Tom Hanks's entire journey, what emerges is not a perfect straight line from the starting point to the peak, but a series of slow steps, sometimes veering off course, sometimes full of contradictions, beginning from a child who had no place to call home, a child who grew up lacking any sense of belonging, always standing on the edge of connections that others took for granted. And it was precisely from that solitude that he learned to observe, to listen, to understand people before understanding himself, an ability that later became the foundation for everything he did. The path he walked was not always clear, not always recognized. There were periods when he was limited to roles that did not fully reflect his abilities. There were times he had to accept imperfect choices to continue existing in a harsh industry. And while his career gradually took shape, his personal life went through mosses not easy to name. A broken first marriage, distances with his family that he could not completely fill, feelings of guilt he carried, not like an explosive burden, but like a quiet current existing for many years. Those events did not make him stop, but they left marks, shaping the way he viewed the world, the way he approached work, and the way he treated those around him. Because when you have experienced the feeling of not being kept, you will understand the value of staying. When you have lost important things, you will know how to cherish what remains in a deeper way. Success came to him not as a simple confirmation, but as a new stage with new demands, where he not only needed to do well but to hold steady, not only to achieve but to maintain. And in that process, he became an image many people look to for stability. A person whose kindness was not only in the roles, but in the way he showed up in real life, in the way he spoke, in the way he responded to the world. And that very thing, while bringing respect, also came with pressures not everyone saw. His body, over time, could no longer keep up with the pace he had once been used to. The health changes, the signs of accumulated fatigue, the experiences like diabetes or the effects from the pandemic had reminded him that nothing was infinite, that everything had its limits, and that continuing was no longer just an easy choice, but a conscious decision, a decision that had to be made every day. But if there was one thing that did not change throughout that journey, it was that he did not stop, not because he did not feel tired, not because he did not have moments when he wanted to let go, but because he had learned that continuing did not need to be perfect, did not need to be strong in the way others defined, but only needed to be enough to take one more step, enough to be present one more day, enough not to let what he had built disappear. The legacy he left was not only in the films, though those were works that had become part of collective memory, but in the way he treated the world, in the consistency in the way he kept his word, in the way he maintained kindness even when no one demanded it, and in proving that a person did not need to be perfect to create lasting influence, that sometimes the most important thing was not that you had never stumbled, but how many times you had chosen to stand up. And as that journey continued, no longer at the speed of the early years, no longer with the pressure to prove or to maintain an unchanging image, but with a slower, more conscious rhythm, Tom Hanks was still there, not as an untouchable icon, but as a human who had gone through many layers of life, carrying wounds that did not need to be hidden, carrying lessons that did not need to be shown, and continuing to live in the way he had learned, not to become something greater, but simply not to disappear from his own life, because after all, what made his journey meaningful was not how much he had achieved, but how he had continued, even when things were no longer as easy as before. Looking back at Tom Hanks's entire journey, what makes people not only admire, but also feel a pang of sorrow, is the contrast between the image and the real person, between an American icon and a child who was once left behind during the years of a broken family. The story has shown very clearly that the loneliness from childhood, the constant moves and the feeling of not belonging anywhere had quietly shaped who he was, so that later, when he stood at the peak with achievements like 2 consecutive Oscars from Philadelphia and Forrest Gump, he still carried with him the fear of being abandoned that no one saw. It is even more heartbreaking when success did not bring complete healing, but sometimes came with profound losses, like the first marriage falling apart, the distances with his children, or the feeling of helplessness when he could not help Chet Hanks avoid his own mistakes, all showing that no achievement was big enough to replace presence in the family. Then came the health incidents like diabetes and the COVID-19 experience, when he, who had once been seen as a symbol of stability, also had to face fragility just like anyone else, making the story even closer and more real to the point it was hard to accept. What is most worth cherishing is not that he had never stumbled, but the way he continued to live, continued to be present, continued to maintain kindness, even when inside there were still unhealed wounds. And from that, the lesson for the American people does not lie in becoming perfect or succeeding at all costs, but in understanding that a person's value is not only measured by achievements, but by how they face losses, by their presence in the family, and by the ability to continue moving forward kindly even when life is no longer as easy as before. If the story about Tom Hanks has touched you, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to show gratitude to a person who has quietly endured more than the world has ever seen. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the halo that not everyone has the courage to face.